Today I have the oral transmission, and I will give you the oral transmission first, then I'll give the teaching on transforming suffering and happiness into enlightenment.
Horror de danger jang, Janto Dungur in Gerwe, Choto, Wogerba, Chimbo, Yunda Shender, Dribaka, then a rung of the Fondi. The Bay Energy, Jerko Zombie yonder Jesus Chamber, Shelshi, the Tamba, Lancha, Dictina, and Town of Jarvi, Lamki, Mang, Chatham Jobber, Lani, the Lamdan Chester down. Lamdan Chester Law, Tambola, Ni, Ganzo, Tundambala, Timbao, Tambona. Simpson Mayan Ben Sea Nam Shondi Dingurgi the Shimbajin Jopala Loco Nayim Chamu Jang, Semki Zing Chimbo Kit De Detukun, the Shikala combat in Pendrova Trinity in Beso, the Thursday Combi Stoven Pere de Jizigna Kana Parcha, Yidma de Andrew Gersoni, the David Korku Yemepa, Jivon, the Rung of Law. Comsrdi lan yopa meshi per parurgi yerkin kona nipr zon shur controla leon dingurgi meshi tikmetan cheperan jerwa yin te no adar longwa ji shawa yin nigmus semjin dingurgi observer jimsun zuzur tokperto mamba dala triyo pe shinda shigo so ti shira za ton nagdon la so be varseti mutsik beton nan la so ba te tog shon ala do ba dan shi memjong war meshi ke te tog lamjki varset kin de men Teter lam jupi varchit kiver mani barsha go teter gumana rangar dengor lam tak chik de mando piblo gaba na dengor te shongwa la gawi lo ke par ni ki jub guba tambo no dengor lam tak chik de mamtim bi namra te ne yid gawa zere chizam shi kyang guni me kyang nimu chewi sirla ni pa yang dang yang de zhang la te panchu de dengor chirta ba shongyang zeri ma shi to go nyam de ba chbu Mang the Comber Shajan, Nyang Stop Chirki Bala Lapo, De la Guba Guni Mepan, Dunger de Jusu Yotna, Maga Sha Magojan, Jusum of Damna, Maga Shigan Pamba Mepago, Nyamu Chirana, Zeri Mafshina, Semtoki, Dunger Chimbo, Young River Tarta, River Tar Yang Trapper, Tsorne Kerlavayan. Zeri Shibi Rungur, Dumur Chungoyang, Yedma Deva, Sora Muzip Nani Shind, Zutkawa Go, the young Fernam Zimin Sartigla, Torjipton, Dochak, Galo Shigan, Narvatam, the Zapar Tartar, the Humurity of Donwa, Namba Yed Chichir Tadne, Zochen Kit Miniba, Wambur Gurdon be Manger Namlim, Joar Tartar, Dumur Data, Yishigim, Summer, Muzungar. Lord Narta, Vigile Ransur, Zonaju, Gum Gusso, Nipa, Dunger, Chokes of Tenir Gav Gombana, Dunger, Lamji Chokes of Tenir Gav Gombana, Teon, Dunger, Gan, Shonjung of Loni, Tambir, gave you it on Chirkimena, Shil, Tamke, Dana, Dunger, La Tene, Payon, Durtava, Tobo, Yoto, Jibatamji, Mount of Samja, Namka, Sergi, Var. Yang rang variant rang zibartar de son guban gago.
In order to benefit and liberate all sentient beings, let's generate the supreme bodhicitta. Now let's begin our class on transforming suffering and happiness into enlightenment. Both suffering and happiness need to be transformed onto the path of practice. In fact, this is really important to each and every one of us, especially nowadays. When we look at the world, there are so many changes happening. Everything's different, and because of that, there's so much suffering, some of which are quite excruciating. Some are because of the departing of their family members or loss of their family members, some because of loss of job and loss of support for their financial situation. So many different kinds of changes that's happening nowadays. And that change creates suffering. So we really need to have lots of strength comes from determined mind. And this kind of determined mind doesn't come from nowhere. Without which, however, we won't be able to work with the suffering or face them at all. Therefore, we really need to study the ways of transforming suffering and happiness into enlightenment. We've talked quite a bit about how samsara is just like a house on fire that is full of suffering. However, this year, I think because many things happened global-wide, and everyone started to have a very refreshing perspective on the suffering of samsara. Whomsoever you are, wherever you are, when all these unimaginable things that happen around you, there are people who can't face them and eventually end up making really irrational choices, doing irrational things. I think it has something to do with the strength of their mind as well as the wisdom. So today, let's continue with the teaching of this text. This text was composed by Tenpe Nyima, the previous great master, whom died in 1926. That's only about 100 years before now. But all the pith instructions he gives in this text, I think, is actually quite profound and poignant for all the sentient beings, especially nowadays. I've read many pith instructions on how to transform suffering and happiness into enlightenment, including Ronsum Pandita, as well as Milarepa's, as well as many masters from Kagyupa, same as Mipa Rinpoche's teachings on how to transform sickness and suffering into enlightenment. And each of them, of course, have their very different perspective or aspect on how to transform suffering and happiness into enlightenment. But Tenpe Nyma's teaching is actually quite poignant. It's the pith instruction that is very vivid, especially for today in the 21st century, especially for all the sentient beings nowadays in the year 2020 who are currently going through lots of suffering. While we can recognize the nature of suffering and then learn how to face it and accept it, I think this is quite important for each and every one of us. Unless, of course, there are practitioners who are really wonderful at doing their practice. I think the rest of us are really very similar. Let it be Westerners, Easterners, people of different skin colors, different ethnics. I think the suffering and happiness is really the same. It's very similar. Therefore, we need to learn from this text about how to transform suffering into enlightenment. In fact, each one of us would feel suffering. But because every one of us is so different, every one of our practice, realization, inner insights, all of these are very different. Therefore, the way we face suffering is very different as well. As I talked about last week, there's a book called Anti-Fragile, where it talked about rather how to face situations such as financial crisis, it is not a teaching on Mahayana Buddhism practice, but it's more from the commerce or financial aspect. There are people who are rather quite fragile and they can't face suffering at all. They would completely collapse in front of suffering. That's for weak people who give up very easily and do not stand up in front of suffering. And there are, of course, another group of people who face suffering and obstacles with lots of resilience. Though he may experience pain as well, but he would be able to be very strong and choose or look at other options rather than give up really easily. He would persevere all the way to the end of suffering and live through with the determination of his mind or strength of such kind of mind. And for a very rare group of people, not only they can accept such kind of suffering, they do not let suffering to crush them. They try to find opportunities inside all the sufferings. And through such kind of suffering or such kind of opportunity that's provided by suffering, they can then make their life even better or even stronger, even more valuable. I think it really applies for the practitioners as well, these three principles, the principles that's talked above. Of course, we're not studying financial crisis or illness, but we're talking about how we can look at practitioners around us. There are practitioners who are completely crushed by suffering and obstacles. There is a group of practitioners who would use their resilience and the strength of their mind and persevere all the way to the end. And there's a very small group of practitioners. They would seize the opportunity of obstacle and thrive from obstacles. Lots of the teachings taught us, in fact, the enemies are of great help to us. Because without enemies, we won't be able to recognize the nature of our mind. Just like Milarepa, without all the obstacles that he encountered in his life, he won't be able to get enlightened. Another example is some practitioners who got ill, and because of such illness, they attend enlightenment, such as Bhikkhuni Pamo, who we talked about in the 7 practices of training the mind. So there are people who are viewed as unlucky or unfortunate and going through lots of obstacles and so on. However, to that specific person, it may be an opportunity. It may be an opportunity to thrive from whatever obstacles that they are going through and eventually find some valuable lessons or learn from such and gain valuable lessons from such experience. Therefore, I really hope that each one of our listeners can gain benefit from this teaching, transforming suffering and happiness into enlightenment. How can you gain benefit then? I think the theory is very simple. It's not like the very thorough inference that's taught in the Buddhist logics, nor the non-duality and equanimity and one taste of the tantric teaching, esoteric teachings. But the teachings over here is very grounded and really simple to understand. But with such grounded language, it talks about the nature or the secret of our mind. As long as we can understand such profound meaning, especially if we familiarize ourselves with diligence and with lots of devotion and lots of practice, maybe this simple pith instruction can change our life drastically. For example, maybe you think that you don't really have a good fate, and your destiny hadn't been too kind to you. However, after learning this text, you would be able to understand how to transform all the sufferings and obstacles happening in your life, and whatever adversities you would encounter after this, you will be able to work with any situations with lots of confidence. So I think listening to this class and studying this text is in fact quite necessary.